Welcome to The Warehouse. Have you ever heard a sermon and thought, how in the world did he discover that? Or where did he get that idea? Every week at Cornerstone Church, two teams dig into the biblical text that'll be taught during our weekend services. We spend hours talking about the text, the context, the culture of the time, you name it. But you can't stuff all that into a 30-minute message. That's where we come in. We're going to show you the stuff in the warehouse that didn't make it to the stage. Hey, Stephanie, what's your favorite season?
I really enjoy all of the seasons. But if I was to pick one, I would pick, this is hard because I enjoy spring, but I hate the tornadoes-ness that can come with it, the crappy weather.
Yeah.
The tornadoes-ness.
Yes. And
That's legit.
I like fall, but I love summer. So that's all I got
So
for
pretty
you.
much winter is the only one that's off limits?
I hate winter.
Well, you said earlier that you like all of them.
Except for winter.
Except for winter.
Three-way tie.
Yeah.
And winter can go to the depths.
Right. Because I don't like the snow from being raised in Texas.
Oh,
I just don't enjoy it.
that's okay. So I like snow.
Ew.
I don't like it when it's cold and not snowy. But if it's cold and snowy, I'm more okay with the cold.
Yeah. I'm not a huge fan. Like whenever I was young, I saw frost on the ground in Texas and I went out and I made a frost angel.
Interesting.
Mm.
Did it work?
No, it
Okay.
did not
I
work.
couldn't imagine that it did.
No, it didn't.
Spring is the correct answer. Spring
You like spring?
It's the best season.
It's a good one.
Life comes back after a long, dark winter of people hitting their water cups on their microphones. But yeah, spring. Probably because my birthday is usually the first or second day of spring.
Nice.
Yeah. So
Lovely.
I've gotten presents and cash in spring, and so spring is my favorite season. Summer, with that regards, I have to give presents and cash to my kids whose birthdays are all in summer. So summer
Really?
might be my least favorite.
Maybe that's
Because it's the most expensive.
I'm the poorest
In
at the end of
summer.
summer.
Yeah.
Nathan, what's your favorite season?
I think my favorite season has to be season 3 of The Office.
Mm-hmm.
It's like
Yeah.
whenever Jim and Pam are finally like starting to be a thing. Yeah. I don't know.
That's a good season, actually.
It's a good season.
That's good. That's where we met Andy.
Yeah, another great. No, I in seriousness, I think fall would have to be my favorite. I don't like how wet and soppy the ground can get in spring.
But it can happen in winter too because of the snow melting.
Yeah, it can.
Ugh.
It can. That's why I said fall is my favorite.
Okay.
Yeah, it just is like the spring can be so moist, you know. I just don't.
I got so excited to talk about roasting hot dogs and marshmallows during the fall that I
You
inhaled
literally
my water
salivated so much that you choked.
and inhaled it.
Hold on. Is s'mores like one of you guys' favorite desserts?
No,
No, definitely not. The hot
is it
dog
one of yours?
Yes. It's
No.
the best.
It's so messy.
It's so messy good.
Ugh.
No, the hot dog is the highlight of the campfire.
Gross.
Yes.
No.
Yes, and then just generally getting to burn things.
That's my kid. That's my
Another
kid.
highlight.
Yeah, fire one, hot dog second.
Yeah.
Okay.
Anyway,
S'mores
no,
12th.
I love like whenever it just starts to turn off, like a little bit chilly. Like in the afternoon is t-shirt weather, and then like whenever it gets dark, it's time to throw on a hoodie and light a campfire. That's my favorite.
The crisp, cold
Yes.
air. Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Not as moist.
very true. So some of you have already suffered some hearing a certain word a couple times.
Moist.
That's our subject today. We're going to be in 2 Corinthians.
Not moist, but suffer.
Oh, okay, that makes sense. I'm like,
yeah.
how's he going to tie in that moist is our subject today?
Because you keep saying it and people are suffering.
Yes. Okay, I gotcha.
2 Corinthians 11:24 through chapter 12, verse 10.
Mm-hmm. You want some big
we're-
ideas?
Yeah.
Oh,
Well, yes. As we're
sorry.
starting a new sermon series this week, we are, because we just had Easter last week.
mhm.
And I have a tendency to totally blank on new sermon series.
No, it's because last week we recorded the science one and it flopped.
Well, no, it didn't flop.
Wow.
It flip-flopped. I mean,
Nobody even wanted to listen to it. It just totally tanked that
No,
episode.
not a flop.
Yeah,
Sorry,
you'll hear
guys.
it. You'll hear it next week, and it will not be a flop.
It was not a
No,
flop.
it'll be great and fantastic. So sorry.
Nice.
But it
I'm laughing
flip-flopped,
too much today.
But I'm totally blanking on what the sermon series is actually called.
Well, I don't know if it has a. Is it officially titled? I know it's like we're talking about like deconstruction and reconstruction, but I don't know if it has an actual, if that's the final title or not.
I like it.
Yeah. But we're talking about those questions that like cause us to evaluate. It's caused some people to walk away from the faith. It's kept some people from coming to the faith. But whenever we like really doubt our doubts and come to God and think about like, what does his word say to these things? We find that there are some very satisfactory answers to these questions. So the first one is, why would a good God allow such suffering?
Mhm.
Awesome.
Which is like a classic question because it just doesn't seem to make sense whenever we look around. If God really is good and loves us, then why do we see so much suffering in our world?
And probably one of the most universal of the questions we're going to be talking about.
Mm-hmm.
And probably one of the reasons we're starting with it
Mm-hmm.
right off the bat.
Yeah.
All
Yep.
right. Well, how about a big idea? What do you have, Stephanie?
I debated on switching mine because it makes no sense after we restudied it, but I'll leave it and then you guys can laugh at me later. But though our outer self is wasting away, our inner self is being renewed day by day. 2 Corinthians 4:16.
I think you can tie it in later and it'll make sense. You also had Parker's, didn't you?
Yes, I do. God allows us to have more than we can handle, so we can boast in him.
Not bad. What was
One of
yours?
the things I really liked about that is it was just a play on like some people misremember a scripture and say like, oh, I know God will never give me more than I can handle. It's like,
Right.
that's actually not true.
Yeah,
that's
that
not what
ain't
the
true.
Bible says. So I liked that play on the
Good job,
common thought.
Parker. You're soap.
Nailed it. What was
good.
yours, Nathan?
Mine was God's power is made perfect in our weakness. Nothing fancy smanchy there. I just took it straight from the text.
Yeah, straight from the text we're studying. Not bad. Not bad. Yeah, I said God will show off when we stop trying to.
Oh.
Dig it.
Yep. Timestamp that. 6 minutes, 57 seconds. My highlight of the episode. What do you guys have for context for this? 2 Corinthians 11:24 through chapter 12, verse 10.
Stephanie ran us through the order of stuff yesterday, which is really helpful because this letter is called 2 Corinthians, but that's actually a little bit of a misnomer whenever we understand the way they're written. You want to walk us through the history?
Yeah, so actually this probably would have been the fourth one written. So the Apostle Paul wrote 2 Corinthians from Macedonia around 55 to 56 AD. This was approximately a year after he wrote 1 Corinthians and a year before he wrote his letter to the Romans. So it was written to the Corinthian church. It would have been probably the fourth one. We see that from additions in 1 Corinthians, where he mentions in 1 Corinthians 5:9 and 2 Corinthians 2:3 through 4.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why.
And
Okay, so talk us through. You said it's fourth. So talk us through.
Oh, okay. So there's two letters that are missing functionally that we do not have access to, but we know in 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians, he mentions other letters that he has written.
Yeah. So in 1 Corinthians 5, he refers to as I previously wrote, which means obviously there's a letter before 1 Corinthians. So that would have been 2 Corinthians. And then in 2 Corinthians, he references both a painful visit and a severe letter that he wrote that seemed to have happened in between 1 and 2 Corinthians. So you've got, 0 Corinthians, then 1 Corinthians, and then a 3 Corinthians, and then 2
Second
Corinthians.
No, yeah.
So we've got four Corinthians.
What we have as 1 Corinthians is probably 2 Corinthians.
Yeah.
And what we have as 2 is probably 4 Corinthians.
Yep.
Paul
2
did some writing to
Corinthians.
these Corinthians.
I
Yeah.
heard it. They didn't say second or fourth. They said 2.
Oh, yeah. I typically would say
4.
second, though.
Okay.
I'm very international.
Whenever we hit I think just thinking thematically about these books, 1 Corinthians is very much like you can tell that the church in Corinth is very dysfunctional. Like they have all kinds of sexual issues. They have stuff with like spiritual gifts and eating food sacrificed to idols, and a lot of like love lacking for one another. And so they just really don't know how to get along. And so whenever Paul writes 1 Corinthians, it's very much centered around helping them be unified as a church body. And then when we get to 2 Corinthians, the occasion of it is that there have been people coming along behind him and saying that that really he's not worth listening to because he's not worth being called an apostle, that they are super apostles, that they have a better pedigree than he has, that they are, more knowledgeable, that they've experienced more spiritual things and done more signs and wonders. And so they deserve to be elevated above Paul. And so then Paul's mission in writing 2 Corinthians is largely to help the Corinthian church to be unified with him in his mission. To back him up.
I like that picture.
Thanks, man.
Yeah, that's really good. Any other context?
So Paul's second letter to Corinthians. So I got this from N.T. Wright's commentary yesterday. But so Paul's second letter to Corinthians explores the meaning of the cross in terms of personal suffering, his own and that all of Messiah's people. And if Galatians, he is angry, and Philippians, he is joyful, in this letter he has deep sorrow and raw wounds of his own recent suffering, and it's very apparent. Yet he is determined to view all of his suffering and his troubles of the world through the lens of the gospel. I just thought that was super good. Where he pulls out the Galatians aspect of being angry and the Philippians of him being joyful. And here we get to see deep sorrow and pain.
Yeah, that's good.
Very cool.
Anything you wanted to add, Jay?
I do not.
Okay. Do you have something else, Steph?
Yeah, just in verse. So through this, we have 2 Corinthians 24 through 12:10. So before that, in verse 23, we see the far more imprisonments. So there, Paul is speaking of being in prison several times, even though in Acts only tells us of one instance up to that time he wrote it. So just like we were talking yesterday about how Acts is not complete. We don't have all of the records of everything that had happened to Paul. So
yeah, and I think another way you could say that would be that Acts is not intended to be exhaustive.
There you go.
It's not like it's an incomplete book that we're missing scraps of it or something, or that they just decided not to tell us details. But it's like its intent was not to give a comprehensive history of the church.
Yeah.
It's telling a story.
And like John's gospel, John says if you wrote everything down, wouldn't be able to keep it written in one thing.
Yeah. I like that.
Yeah, surely the same has to be said for the Acts of the Apostles.
Yeah,
as the church exploded.
If Jesus said, "You guys are going to do greater works than I did,"
yeah. Well, let's dive in.
I do want to. I'm sorry. I'm going to pull a Stephanie
after you dive in. After you bring something else, we'll dive in.
I just so in looking at this argument and what he's getting ready to bring out, I think chapter 11, verse 16. So this is more immediate context. 16 and 17, I think sets the foundation for this argument that we're jumping into. So he says, "I repeat, let no one think me foolish, but even if you do, accept me as a fool, so that I too may boast a little. What I am saying with this boastful confidence, I say not as the Lord, but as a fool." And so whenever we read that, we should know that we are entering into a space where Paul is going to defend his ministry. And as he's doing it on the terms that these other that have been set by these other, quote unquote, super apostles. And he's like, I don't even like talking like this because it's kind of foolish. It's kind of a peeing contest just to set up who's done more things and who's got a better pedigree and more knowledge and all that. He's like, I don't really like doing that. And whenever we read, I say not as the Lord, that's typically something that Paul would say whenever he was saying not as Jesus did. So he's saying hey, Jesus never said, well, here's my background. He's saying I don't like to have to do this, but I need to. Does that make sense to you guys?
Mm-hmm.
Real good. Real good. Hey, let's dive in. How about we'll start verses 24 to, what do you think of 29?
I like it.
That sounds good.
29? Let's go.
So can I list? You want to read first?
No,
go
list.
ahead. No. It's fine. Read.
Oh, thanks.
I forgot about that.
5 times I received at the hands of the Jews the 40 lashes, less 1. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. A night and a day I was adrift at sea, on frequent journeys, in danger from rivers, danger from robbers, danger from my own people, danger from Gentiles, danger in the city, danger in the wilderness, danger at sea, danger from false brothers, in toil and hardship, through many a sleepless night, in hunger and thirst, often without food, in cold and exposure. And apart from other things, there's the daily pressure on me of my anxiety for all the churches. Who is weak, and I'm not weak? Who is made to fall, and I am not indignant? All right, that's a list.
That was good reading.
I think all the danger from Gentiles, danger in the city, danger in the wilderness reminds me of like a Roberta Christie novel or something.
Yeah, that's as I was reading this week, it was really poetic, and the poetic nature of that part struck me.
I have no idea who that is. Okay.
Wait, I said the wrong name. Who did Murder on the Orient Express?
It was Agatha Christie.
Agatha Christie. Okay, Roberta Christie was one of my teachers in college. Same last name, very different person. Sorry about that, all you fans.
But he went there with you, so
yeah. Like
no, I didn't.
No, you didn't.
You didn't see my face. I was trying to.
You're like you were trying to save me from whatever.
As he was looking on his computer, I was like, "Well, he'll come up with some great author."
It's just like Death on the Nile, Murder on the Orient Express, Danger in the Wilderness. It just
If you'd have brought a book with you, I could have grabbed.
It was a dumb joke. Thank you for indulging me.
It's just good.
But of course, suffering. So we're starting this series off with a sermon on suffering, and we're diving into Paul listing some of the many ways he's suffered.
I thought it was really interesting. You were talking about the 40 lashes minus 1 yesterday, and like the difference between that and the rods. I would love to hear you just kind of.
Oh, sure. Yeah. So the 40 lashes less 1. So 40 lashes minus 1. I'm not a 39. Math guy. Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I'm not a math guy. So I'm glad you brought that in. It's 39. So when we remember Deuteronomy 25, that's where the Jewish law comes in of bringing 40 stripes, 40 lashes may be given, but not more, lest if one should go on to beat him with more stripes than these, your brother be degraded in your sight. So 40 was the cap on someone receiving lashes. And one of the things I found that could explain why there were 39 is because of the type of scourge used. So found this. According to the manner of scourging, a scourge of 3 cords could be used, that every stroke went for 3, so that by 13 strokes, 39 stripes were given. And if a 14th had been added, then there would have been 42 stripes and would have exceeded what the law allows. So again, he's talking about he received from the Jews the 40 lashes minus 1. So it would make sense that it would be 39 because you use a thing that has 3 and you hit them 13 times with it versus trying to count, 1, 2.
I thought that made a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like I've always kind of wondered, like, keeping track of 39 of them. It's like, what if you lose track? So,
yeah, right.
Makes sense.
Yeah, because they had a fear of going over and hitting the 40 mark because that would have been what would have killed them necessarily is what they were thinking. So if they kept it in the safe zone of doing 39, then it wasn't going above it. So they did it out of fear, not out of mercy for the person.
Yeah, there was no mercy for Paul, especially at the hands of the Jews. And then you talk about, pardon me, then you talk about 3 times he was beaten with rods. So to be beaten with rods translates a Greek word rhabdizo, found only twice in the Bible. It means to hit with a long, stiff stick. Here, and then the event Paul was talking about it in Acts 16 are the only times that verb beaten with rods is used. And we'll see a couple. Stephanie mentioned some of the things Paul mentions are talked about mostly in Acts, and this is one of them. Acts 16 is where he was beaten with rods, and this would not have been by the Jews. This would have been by the Romans.
Yeah, and the not cool part, but the interesting part to me is that it goes in from talking about Jew punishment to Roman punishment. Mm-hmm. So like he is not left by anybody. Basically, like his own people and the people that were not his were beating him. Yeah, so the rods were usually made of birch wood, and the Roman soldiers would beat their victims mercilessly all over their entire body. The other frequent punishment with using rods was to bind the victims, lift them upside down with their feet exposed, and beat the bottom of their feet, breaking the bones in their feet. And so also remembering the map and the endless miles that Paul would walk to bring the gospel.
Yeah, so there was a chance these times he was beaten with rods. When we think about all the miles he walked, there's a good chance that at least one of the 3 times he was beaten with rods, he was beaten about the feet.
Mm.
And kept walking. That's amazing to me.
Huh.
And like I was going to say this earlier, but like the resume that he brings here to show like his suffering, like he has this huge list of all of these ways that like to them would not have been showing the love, like God's love. Because I think you explained it yesterday, or it was Parker who just talked about like the apostles would have viewed themselves like, if you're suffering, then you're not within the love of God. But if you're
the super apostles,
yes,
so these
the
so-called
super
apostles,
yeah,
not the actual
not
followers
the
of
actual
Jesus.
apostles. So these apostles that he's like going up against.
Yeah. So far, 5 times he's been whipped by the Jewish people. 3 times beaten with rods by the Romans. Once he was stoned, and that story is in Acts chapter 14, where he was stoned, and thinking he was dead, they dragged him outside of the city, and he wasn't dead. So he got up and went back to the people, slept a little bit, ate a little bit, and then went back to preaching.
Yeah.
And also, I didn't know the act of being stoned is to be lapidated, to lapidate someone. Lapidate. To lapidate someone is to stone them.
What does that mean?
To stone them.
He's just giving us our vocab word right now. He said,
I don't
to lapidate.
know what that means.
So no, the word lapidate means to stone.
So lapidate, is that the Greek word?
Nope.
It's
Okay.
an English word.
Okay, I don't. Do you know this word, Parker?
He does now because we just said.
Yeah, that was the point of.
Multiple times. Got it.
Yeah.
Cool. Moving on.
It's not like, yeah, it's just to add your vocabulary word if you want to impress some friends at work.
Do you not have the toilet
You
paper that
guys
gives
are
you
my
new...
friends at work.
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, I'm saying if you pull it out tomorrow.
Well, we don't remember what goes on in here anyway. So when you come in Monday and say, "Hey guys, don't get lapidated,"
I just imagine 420 or something like that. Her trying to use lapidated. And we're like, not that kind of stoned.
Yeah. We did not. Those guys getting lapidated.
Sorry, it may be inappropriate. I don't know. Too far.
Thank you for that, Pastor Nathan.
Just draw out the pastor.
3 times I was shipwrecked. And so by the time we get to Acts 27, that was probably his 4th shipwreck, because 2 Corinthians was written more than likely before Acts 27.
Mm-hmm.
How crazy is that? So by the end of his life, at least 4 shipwrecks.
Yeah.
4 shipwrecks.
It's interesting. So he's showing hey, I have enemies. I'm enemies with the Jews, enemies with the Romans. Also, just a dang shipwreck. Nobody. Yeah. It was nobody's fault. Yeah. It just happened.
Mother Nature doesn't like me either.
Yeah. And you see that, throughout the rest. So adrift at sea, and then danger from rivers. That's not anybody's fault. Danger from robbers. That's somebody's fault, but not even necessarily that they hate him. They just want his money.
Yeah.
So it's just he's just fleshing out this illustration, this picture of I've suffered a whole lot.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so danger there, peril, risk, but it's a word that's found 9 times in the New Testament. 8 of them are right here in this bit of scripture.
That's a lot. Pointing us back through the book of Acts, we read no less than 18 journeys Paul took by ship, with half of them occurring before writing of 2 Corinthians. So some historians have said that there is no other man in ancient world who is recorded to have traveled as extensively as Paul did. I just think that's neat.
That was cool.
Yeah.
I had never thought about that.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then, so he's the same guy who wrote Romans 10, who says like, beautiful on the mountain are the feet of those who bring the good news, and has like this passion for like, how are people going to get saved unless they hear the gospel, and how are they going to hear unless somebody tells them, and how is somebody going to tell them unless we send them? So just major passion for missions.
Oh man.
Do you know what we missed to talk about in context? Is that Paul would have enjoyed being in Corinth for the fact that he could have been selling his tents because he was a tent maker. And so he wouldn't have to rely on the people, the church, as much. He would have been able to use his own gifts and talents to help bring in profit.
Why? Why specifically would
that be
Corinth be an enjoyable place for a tent maker?
Because it was a hub, like it was a place where they could dealers and trade makers
Lots of merchants and stuff.
Yeah, merchants. Yeah. And so with that, pointing out the context of Romans. Mm-hmm. So he would have been in Corinth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So after 2 Corinthians, at some point he goes and ends up staying in Corinth for a few months and writing the book of Romans, which seems to be that like stuff simmered down a little bit in Corinth where he could focus on writing and not just having to put out fires.
Yeah. I would just remember that. I was like, that's a really important context piece, because you hear this harshness almost, and then so to like lay it out that, hey, it's okay. He ends up coming there and it'd be great.
Yep.
Great.
Yeah. And here again, to speak to what we were talking about being lashed by the Jews and beaten by the Romans, and then nature trying to kill him. Here again, verse 26 kind of wraps that all together too. Rivers, robbers, my own people, other people. And that's an interesting play on words too. My own people and Gentiles there. It's the word that we get genus from. So his kin. Mm-hmm. So danger from my kin, danger from the other, danger from my people, danger from every other people. Mm-hmm. So they're Gentiles is the ethnon. So probably race. So different tribes, so every other foreign person. So not one group like the Romans. He's talking about all danger from my people and every other person.
Mm-hmm.
And I hadn't really picked up on this yesterday, but whenever he says false brothers, so that would be not only the Jews and the Gentiles, but also people who say they are Christians.
Yeah.
So like people within the church that I should feel safe with.
Yeah.
That he's experienced danger from them as well, which is practically actually what's happening in Corinth right now. Yeah. Like these are false brothers, people who are, claiming apostleship, but want nothing to do with him.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Anything else through 27? Because then he shifts gears in 28 and talks about the daily pressure on me of my anxiety for all the churches.
I really liked that he drew this out. I actually highlighted it while we were studying it. Because it's like, I just really like that he says that he feels anxiety for the people in the churches. Mm-hmm. And he's not even like confessing it as a sin, because there's a way of engaging anxiety that is sinful, but he's not even saying like, I sin all the time by being anxious. He's just saying that like, it's a normal part of the pressure of being in church leadership.
Yeah.
And so for any of you guys that have like been in that kind of environment, or been even like just had a role in helping disciple someone else, like you start to feel the weight of responsibility for the people that you are leading and caring for. And it does contribute to it. It's like, not only am I caring about myself, I think about parents. Parents are like not only responsible for themselves, but they're responsible for their kids. And so you start to feel for the things that your kids are going through.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So Paul's just saying like, hey, on top of all this other stuff, there's like, it's very physical in nature. There's this emotional, spiritual stress of anxiety for these people I'm supposed to be leading.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because people are involved.
Yeah.
And anytime people are involved, there's going to be stress, and there's going to be friction, and there's going to be hurt and pain.
Yeah. So 28, and apart from these things can also be translated to apart from these external things. So how he lists all of these external things, and then he goes into an internal thing. So how you were just saying and setting it up, physical versus emotional.
Yeah. Anxiety there is the same word as in 1 Peter 5:7, where Peter tells us to cast all your cares on him. So that same word for cares is that word for anxiety. I thought that was a neat match there.
Mm-hmm.
Who is weak? And I'm not weak. Feeble is another way to say that one too. Feeble. Who's made to fall, and I'm not indignant. We had a fun conversation about that as well. So who is made to stumble? Who is caused to stumble? And I'm not indignant, or I don't burn.
Yeah. And it's a little bit veiled still to me as far as like, it's not as straightforward as the other stuff. My interpretation of it like tends to land that who is weak and I am not weak. So he's just saying like, hey, for any of you who are weak, I'm also weak. Mm-hmm. So just saying like, it's not like I don't struggle with things. I've got my own things going on. And, so a lot of these that he's, more akin to being beaten and like the stuff that he's personally suffered. And then who is made to fall and I am not indignant. I kind of link to that verse 28 with the feeling the pressure for these other churches. So when you have the made to fall, it seems to indicate that somebody was the one who made that person to fall. And I'm not indignant. It sounds to me like he's saying, hey, anytime, one of you guys ends up struggling because of a false teacher or something going on in your church, like I end up bearing the weight of that, feeling indignant, like I need to step in and fix the problem.
Yeah, because there's no such thing as a super apostle.
Right.
So because if anybody was going to be, it's going to be him.
Yeah.
And he says, I'm not weak. Of course I'm weak. And these guys who call themselves super apostles are making people stumble over here.
And I'm indignant. Yeah.
All right. Anything else for that section?
Not for me.
Oh, well, what do you say we do a bit of a long one and go from verse 30 down to verse 6 of chapter 12?
I say yes.
It's a big break. Okay.
Oh, are we reading 30? Because we didn't end up studying it.
Oh, that's right.
So we can just start with 12.
I gotta say something about 33.
If I must boast, I will boast of the things that show my weakness. The God and Father of the Lord Jesus, he who is blessed forever, knows that I'm not lying. At Damascus, the governor under King Aretas was guarding the city of Damascus in order to seize me. But I was let down in a basket through a window in the wall and escaped his hands. I must go on boasting, though there is nothing to be gained by it. I'll go on to visions and revelations of the Lord. I know a man, hint, hint, in Christ who 14 years ago was caught up to the third heaven, whether in the body or out of the body, I do not know. God knows. And I know that this man was caught up into paradise, whether in the body or out of the body, I do not know. God knows. And he heard things that cannot be told, which man may not utter. On behalf of this man, I will boast. But on my own behalf, I will not boast, except of my weakness. Though if I should wish to boast, I would not be a fool, for I would be speaking the truth. But I refrain from it, so that no one may think more of me than he sees in me or hears from me. Anybody have anything for verse 33?
So this passage describes the wall crown, a Roman military honor that was presented to the first soldier to go up over the wall of an enemy city. It was made of gold and fashioned to look like a wall of fortified city. However, Paul's descent from the wall of the city in a basket was the opposite of the military bravery and was a token of his humiliation and weakness. It is suggested that Paul was not the first one up, but the first one down, and that he may have intended to evoke laughter at this picture. The passage also notes that such as an inglorious escape is hardly something about which one would choose to boast, and that's Paul's apostle career opened on the note of a humiliation and disgrace. So just the comparisons. So I just read that, but the comparisons here of like how it's a victory for somebody to cross over into a city, and just how Paul is like showing his humiliation of being like, no, I was let down in a basket, and that would have been humiliating. So just the opposites.
So you're saying like it was a Roman tradition for their soldiers to have like a competition to see who could get to the top of the wall first, right?
Yeah,
and they would be crowned with they would get like a crown, a victory crown or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
You ever think some guys writing commentaries try a little too hard?
I heard whenever I heard that, I'm not gonna lie, I was like, I think he's just describing the fact that he had to escape like
the Duke boys and the Dukes of Hazzard.
What?
He had to be let down through a window. So anyway, I've heard it just being very practical, but
I had to do some kind of escape act because they were gonna grab me, but I had work to do.
Yeah. But who knows?
Yeah.
It could have been.
Who knows?
He could have been trying to be funny. Who knows?
Coulda.
And that reference is Acts 9:25 that he's talking about being let down in the basket in Damascus. So again, reading the book of Acts is full of some pretty cool stuff.
It's a good
that
one.
gets referenced later. Also, if I must boast, I'll boast of the things that show my weakness. Who does that?
Mm-hmm. Paul.
Yeah, Paul.
It was
does.
a rhetorical question. Sorry.
Paul and Parker, these guys. Yeah, we don't naturally do it, right? We try to downplay or hide our weakness. We were talking about resumes yesterday. Nobody puts that time that they burnt the chicken, or the time that I spilled water all over myself or couldn't swallow. We don't put that on our resume. We put how man, I led these people and they were excited, and I was the first to the wall, and that's what I put on my resume.
Yeah.
We rarely boast in our weakness.
My biggest weakness is that I care too much.
That's right. I don't have weaknesses.
That's my greatest weakness.
Down in verse 3, we talk about that this man that Paul knows was caught up into paradise. That 3 times in the New Testament as well. That version of paradise. Once is when Jesus is telling the thief on the cross that today you're going to be with me in paradise. And the other in Revelation 2, talking about the tree of life that's in the paradise of God.
Mm-hmm.
And so very practically, I mean, there's some things about this that are confusing as far as like what's meant by being in the third heaven and all that stuff that's like, don't really understand a whole lot. I'm sure there are people who understand a lot more than I do about that. But what we can say that's clear from this is that he's describing a vision that he had. And he doesn't know like to what degree, like, was he awake or asleep? Was he like actually transported somewhere to see this? Or was he just having kind of an out of body revelation? And could be either way. He's like, I don't know.
Yeah, that's good. Just numerology wise, 3 is the number of completeness.
Yep.
So it could be just a numerology kind of thing that he was in the place,
the highest of heavens.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The complete place. Definitely could be.
I'm thinking of the I know a man, like here, and how he's talking about himself in third person.
Mm-hmm.
And I wouldn't have gotten that if it wasn't for you guys and like a commentary, because I read it multiple times. I'm like, who's the man he knows?
Yeah. Introduce me.
I want to meet him.
He's like really proud of this friend that he has.
That's right.
Yeah.
I've got a friend.
But you put it yesterday, I think, Nathan, just like how he's like, I'm sick of talking about myself. Was that you who said that, or?
Yes, because these quote unquote super apostles, like one of the other kind of checks that they had for validity had to do with signs and wonders, including visions and revelations. And so they would place, like, even culturally, Judaism had a category for revelations that they would see them as awe-inspiring and important and kind of put you in a hero category. Same thing with the Greeks and Romans. They thought of these things to be like divine revelation whenever you would have a vision. And so he's going on and continuing to lay out his resume, but you can also tell that he kind of almost wants to distance himself a little bit from it because he's really tired of talking about himself. He doesn't like doing this. And I find that encouraging because I've had some friends in the past who really don't like to read Paul because they're like, man, he just brags about himself all the time. Right. And so seeing all the disclaimers he's giving in here, how he really doesn't want to, but he also knows, let's see, one of the commentaries I read talking about 12:1, whenever he says, though there's nothing to be gained by it, D.A. Carson said, though there's nothing to be gained by it, there's much to be lost if he doesn't. Mm-hmm. So if he just stays silent on this issue, then the super apostles win, and they on foolish grounds get him disqualified in the minds of the Corinthian church. Mm-hmm. So it's like, I have nothing to gain from this. I'm not trying to make myself look, bigger in your eyes, but I know that I have a lot to lose if I don't.
Yeah. Boy, that's good. Also, I had read, and I couldn't find the reference, but I had read someone who suggested that the 14 years ago when he was caught up, they tried linking it to Acts 22:17 when Paul's talking to people in Jerusalem, and he tells them that when I'd returned to Jerusalem and was praying in the temple, I fell into a trance and saw him saying to me, "Make haste and get out of Jerusalem quickly, because they will not accept your testimony about me." So, no proof of it, but I thought that was a neat.
Could be, or it could be this was a regular occurrence for him too. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really cool.
That's a neat thought.
Yeah. I missed you saying that yesterday. That was good.
I missed you saying it too.
That's why I said it today.
Thanks.
Man.
Anything else up to verse 6?
Verse 4, and he heard things that cannot be told, which man may not utter. So we discussed a little bit about that yesterday, what we kind of took into that. So Revelation 10:4, Parker found, and when the 7 thunders had sounded, I was about to write, but I heard a voice from heaven saying, "Seal up what the 7 thunders have said and do not write it down." So just yesterday we were discussing, is it something he couldn't say, or maybe it was said to him in a way that he wouldn't understand, or what?
Yeah. Like unspeakable, like he can't physically do it.
He can't find the words for it.
Right.
Yeah.
Or, he was sworn to secrecy.
Not permitted.
Yeah, told not to. So I liked the finding of Revelation 10:4 yesterday.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I enjoyed verse 6. He said, so he's like, I could continue, I could boast as much as I want to, and I would not be a fool because I'd be speaking the truth. He's like, the fools are like making up stuff about their resume, but I legit have the resume, but I refrain from it so that no one may think more of me than he sees in me or hears from me. It just seems to be, he's saying it seems that whenever he's going into these planting these churches, he doesn't bring up all this stuff. He doesn't just say hey, you need to listen to me because of all these reasons, because of my accolades, because of my heritage, because of my suffering. I'm legit because of what I've done. He wants them to take him for what they see in him and hear from him. He wants to be standing just on I just preached the gospel to you.
Yeah.
And you see a humble man preaching the gospel.
Yeah, that's what he told him the first time. Well, in 1 Corinthians chapter 2, when I came to you, brothers, I did not come with eloquence or superior wisdom, as I proclaimed to you the testimony about God. For I resolved to know nothing while I was with you except Jesus Christ and him crucified. I
love that addition. It gets me really excited because I just get this storyline starting to form in my head of he goes and he chooses not to brag about himself or establish anything on his own reputation, but banks everything on the veracity of the gospel. This is what will change your life. Mm-hmm. And so then he does that and he leaves. And then these other guys come in. They're like, now, what did he even really know? I mean, we've got all this pedigree and stuff. And he's like, I didn't want to do this with you guys. I wanted you to hear the gospel plain and simple. But if you need a resume to compare, I've got it.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so having the resume, choosing not to share it, but then only coming in weakness and fear and with much trembling, preaching Christ and him crucified.
But then and the only reason he's choosing to do it now is because as these super apostles are throwing him out, they're also trying to throw out the gospel that he preached. It would. I have a feeling that it wouldn't even be a big deal if it was just about him, but because he sees that as they're throwing him out, they're throwing the gospel out with it. They're kind of forcing his hand. Yeah.
Man, oh man. Anything else through verse 6? I got the head shake no, so we're going to keep her to that. Verses 7 through 10. So to keep me from becoming conceited because of the surpassing greatness of the revelations, a thorn was given me in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to harass me, to keep me from becoming conceited. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord about this, that it should leave me. But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. For the sake of Christ, then, I am content with weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities. For when I am weak, then I am strong.
Mm.
Man, he was a pretty good writer.
Yeah.
I mean, pretty good. Not as good as Robin Christie.
Roberta Christie. And I'm pretty sure she was my math teacher at Shawnee Community College.
Yeah, my mom's first name was Roberta.
Roberta.
She went by Robbie.
Okay.
Why weren't you a Robert?
I'm a Jack Robert.
But why were you not Jack Roberta?
She didn't like either of those names,
Okay.
and so she called me Jay.
Good story.
Jack Robert, I guess, is my thorn. Speaking of thorns,
this is such an interesting passage for a number of reasons. Like, it's really rich in some ways, and it's kind of like one of the centerpieces of like why we're talking about it in the context of this question:
Yeah.
Why does God allow suffering?
yeah,
And it also brings up some interesting questions, because you have a messenger of Satan being sent to him to harass him, to keep him from being conceited. And whenever you have this, we know, like from looking at Job and other places in the scripture, like Satan never gets to do anything without the Lord's consent. He only has the authority that's been given him by God. He's not an equal or a peer. So whenever we see this, the thorn was given me in the flesh, God allowed Satan to come and inflict some kind of issue, like some kind of discomfort upon Paul. And so it's just a really interesting thing. It was in Job and it is here.
yeah. And I think one of the reasons why we have such a hard time hammering down what this thorn meant, what this thing, this picture is because that this word thorn, this word used that we translate thorn, this is the only place it's used in the Bible. It's called we've talked about it before, it's called a hapax legomenon. These words that are, go ahead.
Legomenon. Legomenon.
So that's the term used for a word that's used only once.
Love it.
Yeah.
It's such
And
a
that's it.
fun word.
So in classical Greek, this word was first used to describe pointed stakes that were arranged around fortifications to impale attackers or were hidden at the bottom of covered pits. They were also used to protect vineyards against thieves. The severed head of an enemy was often hoisted upon one of these as a sign of triumph. Impaling on a thorn was a means of execution, originally distinct from crucifying, but later, in many cases, identical with it. So that's one way of talking about. In the Septuagint, which is the Greek Old Testament translation, this word is used sometimes as sliver, as a thorn that we would think of like as a rose bush thorn.
Are those stakes around a fortification, is that the same thing as like a palisade?
Ooh,
Like palisades often are like spiked fences, kind of.
I think so.
Okay.
That's how it sounds anyway. And so that being only used once and there being a little bit of ambiguity around the word, so people through the ages have gone with different explanations about what it might be, because he doesn't explain what it is. He doesn't say, I've got double vision and that's my thorn. So Phillips said it was a physical handicap of some kind. Plummer mentioned a painful malady like a stake driven into his flesh. Tertullian thought it was an earache, Chrysostom a headache, and Augustine saw it as just a general term for all of his sufferings. Others have thought it was an affliction of the eyes. That's what I have grown up hearing the most, that it was an eye issue. Still others, because of the phrase messenger of Satan found in the verse, think the thorn was a false prophet at Corinth who tried to refute the message which Paul preached.
I've also heard of the messenger of Satan to harass. I've also heard just like as a general like sin temptation. So not that like, not even something physical, but the fact that you keep having this struggle. And there's some things I like about that from a Romans 7 perspective of him saying like, why do I keep doing the things I don't want to do? And I can't do the things I want to do. Wretched man that I am, who will deliver me from this body of death? Like you kind of feel that there. And so anyway, I just wonder would there be potentially a perpetual temptation?
Oh man.
I don't know. It's just a thought.
And then if you think, didn't we talk about Romans being written in Corinth?
Yeah.
After this. And so maybe he was even thinking of that when he was writing Romans 7. Holy cow.
But yeah, there's a lot of different things that it could be.
Yeah.
And we're not going to figure it out. It's
Yeah.
just
Right.
interesting to think about.
And so with that take, if it is this temptation issue, you roll into verse 8 and you read 3 times, I pleaded with the Lord about this, that it should leave me. And how many of us have sat in the dark of our homes pleading for God to remove these things from us? They're pleaded there. It's this picture of inviting God in to bring, to call near. So asking God to come near and deliver me from this thing.
Yeah. Yesterday I talked about just how Satan to harass me and pleading with the Lord. For me personally, like, there's moments in my life where I feel like, man, the enemy is just really just trying to get me down, and he's whispering lies into my head and making me think these things that are just not true, and where I've fallen to my knees and pleaded with the Lord, like, please take this from me, because I just cannot anymore, and I don't want to feel this or hear this. And so, like, the passion that is behind the pleading part of, like, we don't desire this. So,
and practically, like, sometimes God does. He does deliver us.
Right.
And, like, we've heard some miraculous stories of something like someone who struggled with alcoholism, and their mama prayed for him for years and years. And, like, one day they took a drink and could not stomach it.
Yeah.
And it's like, man, praise God. That's amazing. That's an example of him removing that from someone. Yeah. But then other times we have the same experience as Paul, where we plead, and what we practically get back is God saying, my grace is sufficient for you.
Yeah.
My power is made perfect in weakness.
Yeah. You brought up yesterday a friend, and I was like, oh, that was so good. And how sometimes we don't always get those answers, because he's like, no, I want you to depend on me in this.
Yeah. A lot of times we think that what should be happening is that we get stronger and stronger, where we can be more independent and where we can stand up against stuff, whether it's, suffering in life, whether it's a temptation, when in reality, like, God wants us to be consistently dependent upon him. He's not looking for us to grow in our independence and our own personal strength.
Right.
He's looking for this, like, the way Paul finishes, for when I am weak, then I am strong. It's not that because I was weak for a season, now I'm strong. It's saying it's like this paradox of the Christian life, is that when we are weak, that's when we are strong, because we're dependent upon Christ.
Right.
Oh, man. That's awesome. What else? You guys have anything else? 7 through 10?
So my power is made perfect. So that word perfect just means complete.
Yeah.
So it's not, I tend to think perfect, and I think of, like, the morally perfect kind of way, flawless. Or like flawless way. And it can mean that other places, but here specifically it means complete. It's like, how would you know how strong God is if you never had to depend on him? But, like, the more we are weak, the more we have to lean on him.
Ooh. And so then, for the sake of Christ, I'm content with weaknesses. How many of us can say that? Content with weaknesses, content with insults, content with hardships, content with persecutions, content with calamities. For when I'm weak, then I'm strong. Well, what are you guys excited to hear about this?
Yeah. I think so kind of where we landed there at the end is what I'm, like, most excited about, because we see, like, though there's a lot of things that we can't make sense of in our suffering, and, like, why things are allowed to happen to us, we can take a lot of comfort in the fact that, like, Jesus' prayer in Gethsemane, as he's talking to the Father and saying, if it's possible, let this cup pass from me, nevertheless, not my will, but your will be done. Jesus knew that if God didn't take it away, that there was something better that God was doing. That God never gives us the worst thing for us. That he always, I'm thinking of, like, Luke, Jesus talks about, all the fathers out there, and he's talking to them and saying, like, hey, if your son asks for bread, you're not going to give him a rock. If your son asks you for fish, you're not going to give him a serpent or a scorpion. And what he's saying is that, like, whenever we ask God for something, if God doesn't give that to us, it's because he's giving us something better, not something worse. And so whenever we ask for deliverance from suffering or a temptation, if we don't receive it, it's not because we're getting something worse. It's because we're getting something better. So, God obviously loved and loves Jesus. He obviously loved Paul, and yet allowed them to go through this because it was doing something better in them. And so we can like have hope in our suffering.
Yeah.
Yeah. Whenever you were talking about that, I was trying to find a quote from Confronting Christianity, and I couldn't find it. But it was talking about like Jesus knew in Gethsemane that he was going to the cross, and that he was pleading with the Lord, like, let this pass from me right now. And then whenever Lazarus was dead, he still wept.
Yep.
But yet he knew there was something greater and better coming from it.
Yeah.
And even though the pain, it hurts, but there's still something better and greater on the other side. And so when we put that in just perspective for us, like how much greater it can be when we learn and know that sometimes our suffering, it sucks and it's not great, but it can be good as long as we're depending on the Lord and using that to like allow us to look more like him.
I like both aspects of what you just drew out of those stories. That so Jesus knew that he was going to raise Lazarus from the dead, and yet in the middle of it, we still have that beautiful, like, shortest verse in the Bible, Jesus wept. That he didn't just skip over it and say, chin up, buttercup, it's going to be fine. Like, Jesus was present in the moment,
and he felt it,
wept with his friends, even though he knew that the other side of it was going to be good.
Gives a new meaning to we mourn, but not like those who have no hope.
Yeah. Exactly.
He is hope.
Yeah.
And still was able to mourn with his sisters.
Yeah.
That were struggling. Oh man.
So it doesn't mean that we like diminish the impact of our suffering, or that we need to just like get over it or move on. But that we can be in it in such a way that still has a hope for the future.
Yes. That's good. Like, because I just think of that so much for myself personally and for others around me. Like, man, I've seen some really low valleys in people's lives and in my own lives, but there's so much beauty and hope when we have our eyes focused on Christ.
Yeah, my mind's been drawn to the people who are going to be in the room who are Christians, who have loved ones who are going through it, suffering upon suffering, and that we as believers have been kind of frozen from entering into it with them, especially as there is doubt that comes about from the suffering. Because, I mean, if we're honest, at some point, there's been a little doubt that has come in when we've suffered before, most of us, if we're honest. And so it feels like there's a fear of entering into it with people because we don't want those questions about why would God do this? And I'm hoping that this would be a springboard for people to jump in and go. That, like we'll talk about next week, that God's not scared of our questions. He's not scared of our doubt. He doesn't think less of us when we do doubt. We'll talk about it next week. That He invited Thomas after the resurrection, just as He invited everyone else. And so, if you're doubting after suffering, or you're scared to even think about joining in with somebody suffering, I hope this is a week where you're unburdened by that and you're able to go, because the gospel can take the pressure from these questions that come about.
Love that.
Anything else, guys?
No.
Hapax legomenon.
Dun, 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 dun.
And that's all we got for this week. So, again, guys, questions, comments, complaints, email us. We're warehouse at cornerstone.team.
Nailed it.
Got it.
First try.
So we'll see you next time. Say bye, me. Bye.
Aw. Bye, Nathan.
Bye.